Welcome to Strip Coverlet, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I am Adrian Fort, and we are here for another poetry discussion that is happening on the channel for two separate events. Number one, because we have a poetry discussion playlist that is now over 160 poems big. And number two, this is National Poetry Month. In National Poetry Month, we have 30 poetry discussions in 30 days. Sundays belong to Sylvia Plath. Mondays belong to William Blake. Tuesdays belong to Edgar Allan Poe. Wednesdays, William Shakespeare. Wednesdays with Willie. Thursday is Emily Dickinson. Friday is Robert Frost. And finally, Saturday is Slumming Saturday with Charles Bukowski. Lastly, before we get into things, there is a link to my personal channel to be found in the description below. I am just 46 subscribers away from 1,000. It would mean the world to me if you would help me get to that mark. Now, we are here for a Sylvia Plath poem, and in Sylvia Plath fashion, I have to admit, I have to confess, I struggle with Sylvia Plath. I struggle with Sylvia Plath every time I read her. So today's poem is titled You Are, and it reads as such. You're clown-like, happiest on your hands, feet to the stars, and moon skulled, gilled like a fish, a common sense thumbs down on the dodo's mode, wrapped up in yourself like a spool, trawling your dark as owls do, mute as a turnip from the 4th of July to April Fool's Day. Oh, high riser, my little loaf. Vague as fog and looked for like mail, farther off than Australia, bent-backed Atlas, our traveled prawn, snug as a bud at home like a sprat in a pickle jug. A creel of eels, all ripples, jumpy as a Mexican bean, right, like a well-done sum. A clean slate with your own face on. So the first thing that I want to take notice with here is the definitive sense of mystery, vague, looked for, traveled. I think you can understand how that would be a little bit vague in this clean slate, in this second stanza here. So let's read it one more time, imagining the images here, paying attention to the general sort of specificity, which is, I understand, ironic, is an oxymoron, general specificity. But I think that there is a point to be made for this later. You're clown-like, happiest on your hands, feet to the stars and moon skulled, gilled like a fish, a common sense thumbs down on the dodo's mode, wrapped up in yourself like a spool, trawling your dark as owls do, mute as a turnip from the 4th of July to April to All Fool's Day. O high riser, my little loaf, vague as fog and looked for like mail farther off than Australia, bent-backed Atlas, our traveled prawn snug as a bud and a home like a sprat in a pickle jug. A creel of eels, all ripples, jumpy as a Mexican bean, right like a well-done sum. A clean slate with your own face on. Now, I always struggle with Sylvia Plath. Always struggle with Sylvia Plath. You even heard it in my reading here. Her language even turns me around. But Sylvia Plath is known as a confessional poet. Okay, so this poem here, pretty lovey-dovey, right? Sort of, it feels like a parent wrapped up in the joy of having a child. Now, what is confessional poetry? What does it mean when we say confessional poetry? The type of poetry that maybe Sylvia Plath pioneered and really brought into its own. I mean, probably more than any other writer, especially before her. This is from, where is this from? It doesn't matter. I don't care. This is a definition from the internet, a poetry site. I can't remember which one it was, about confessional poetry. What is confessional poetry? Confessional poetry is a style of poetry that is personal, often making use of a first person narrator. It is a branch of postmodernism that emerged in the United States in the 1950s. The use of this first person perspective makes it likely that a great majority of these poems are reflective of the poet's own life. That is confessional poetry. Did you catch it? Unfortunately and ironically, the sort of dark arts of literati, of the artist, the dark arts of artistry, often take words and completely disregard what a word means. Use a word definitional to something and, kind of discard what the word actually means. So here we have a school of poetry that is maybe abusing the language. So, confessional. I don't remember if this is dictionary.com or Webster's, Merriam-Webster's dictionary. 1. An act of confessing, especially a disclosure of one's sins in the sacrament of reconciliation. A session for the confessing of sins. Go to confession. 2. A statement of what is confessed, such as a written or oral acknowledgement of guilt by a party accused of an offense. A formal statement of religious beliefs, creed, the Augsburg Confession of the Lutheran Church, an organized religious body having a common creed. So, there's two possibilities here. One, when we say that a poetry, a poem, a poet is a confessional poet, it is to suggest that they are a religion of themselves, a formal statement of religious beliefs. Are they a religion of one? The self worshipping? Maybe. Sometimes Sylvia Plath reads that way. Or are we disregarding what it means to confess? The disclosure of sins, acknowledgement of guilt. Or is this poem here a confession of sorts? What could I mean by that? Well, Sylvia Plath, or so I'm told, I all of the stuff that I know about Sylvia Plath is stuff that basically I've had to pick up from other sources. Is, hey, I don't get this poem. Let me see what other people say about it. And then I sort of try to mold my own take on things because I think that's absolutely necessary, not just to reading literature, but what does it mean to be running a channel about literature if I'm not giving you my opinion on things, but just someone else's? So I'm not going to do that. Part of what we get from Sylvia Plath from time to time is this sort of admission in her poetry that she feels alienated by motherhood. A phrase, an idea, a thing, a ness, which would seem as close to sacrilegious, perhaps, as anything you'll find in sort of mainstream society. To say that you have this child, and instead of feeling ultra responsible for it and super close to it, you feel alienated in a way that you did not expect, that you did not see coming. So, if we assume that to be the case with Sylvia Plath's poetry, if we accept that that is what is going on there, that the confessions in much of her poetry are this confession that no, I don't feel that ever loving bond, and I don't know why. If we're willing to accept that, if we're willing to say, okay, Sylvia, that's a confession. Is this, as naked as it may be, then a confession of that connection? Or possibly, is it sort of this meta attempt to feel that connection? Or is this, in fact, a poem of alienation? The only real term of endearment that we have in this poem is the phrase, my little loaf. That itself may be less than endearing. Everything else is a description. You are clown like. What does clown like mean? It means bumbling and fumbling around. Okay. You are happiest on your hands. What does that mean? Crawling around. You are happiest on your hands, feet to the stars. Still crawling around, and moon scold. The light bouncing right off that big baby noggin. These, as sort of pleasant as they sound, are not actually ownership phrases. They're not. I do not own the love that is happening there. It is clown like. I do not really internalize these things. I am simply explaining them. You are clown like. You are wrapped up in yourself like a spool. Is it all of these terms that we hear, a baby wrapped up in itself like a spool? Oh, you are clown like, happiest on your hands, feet to the stars. Oh, is that simply eliciting the reaction in us? But our speaker here is not partaking in this. And in fact, by the time our speaker gets to that term of endearment, it's time to jump off into those vague as fog and looked for like mail farther off than Australia. The moment our speaker sort of gives in to this term of endearment, my little loaf, our speaker jumps off into the mystery, into the void, into the nothingness, into the abyss. Is that, then, what's going on here? Is it still a confessional poem? As ornate, as dolled up as it may be? I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the confession is. I'm not sure if the confession is the fact that our speaker is feeling these terms of love, or if the confession is that those things are missing from our speaker. That is all I have time for here for this poetry discussion of You're by Sylvia Plath. There is going to be a poem tomorrow as well. There are poems every day this month, and I hope to have you back for the next one.